This is Dr. Stan here at Radio Liberty, coming to you from the hills overlooking beautiful and picturesque Monterey Bay, and bringing you the news behind the news, the story behind the story. Hoping to convince you that reality is usually scoffed at, that illusion is usually king. But in the battle for the survival of Christian civilization, it's going to be reality and not illusion or delusion that'll determine what the future will bring. And I need to remind you the views expressed here are not necessarily those of the owner's management, staff, sponsors, or the supporters of the station you're listening to. They happen to be my views, and well, for the next hour, they're going to be the views of Donald Wilson. We're going to be talking about a book he's written, and it's going to be available in book form, hopefully one of these days. But it's going into the foundation of the ideas that led to America. And America is really a unique nation. It's a unique nation because, of course, here, built into our concept of government is this idea that we are not a democracy, specifically not a democracy. We are to be a republic. And, of course, certainly the foundation of our ideas of individual freedom came from Europe. And, of course, most people think these ideas came from Great Britain, the idea of being an English citizen. And, of course, the people during the Revolutionary War were fighting for their rights as Englishmen. But Donald has some different views, and so I've asked him to come on. Fascinating information he's compiled. And, Donald, thank you very much for being with us. Tell us how you got interested in this idea of the origins of the ideas that led to America and what you've actually found.
Oh, well, thank you for having me on. The way I got interested was every time I'd be in school, my two favorite founders were Patrick Henry and Sam Adams, and every time I'd read a book, regardless of who the expert was, they'd always say, well, we weren't really revolutionaries. We weren't really doing anything that drastic. We were just fighting for our rights as Englishmen. And, of course, as a kid, when you see them firing on the king's troops or reading about it and other such things, you think, well, that probably is a pretty radical idea. And, you know, Sam Adams was Welsh and Patrick Henry was Scottish. And so it always kind of struck me in the wrong way because I didn't actually see a lot of Englishmen. And then what happened is when I was in college, we had to do a project where we had to write a proposal for a grant, and we didn't have to prove the grant. We just had to make it believable enough that a corporation would give us the money from the grant proposal we wrote. And the more that I investigated and the more that I read, I found out that there was a lot of information for that premise, and the more I tried to disprove it, the more true that it became that we, in fact, were not fighting for our rights as Englishmen, that, in fact, most of these men came from the Celtic countries, whether it be Wales, Ireland, Scotland, and especially the ones that were the Presbyterian Whigs that came out of Scotland. They wanted nothing to do with the English. They hated the English, and I soon figured out that we as Americans, we use the terms English and British interchangeably, and I think that's where a large source of our confusion comes from.
All right, fine. Well, now explain that and explain the difference in the philosophy between the people of Scotland. I just happen to be Scots, so I have I'm very, very interested in these concepts. I've been to the homeland there. In fact, there's only one lake in all of Scotland, and that's Lake Menteith, named after my name. But go right ahead. Certainly, what is the difference between the Scots and the English as far as their ideas, as far as these concepts of freedom?
Well, it starts early on. Most people don't realize that Scotland was never conquered by the Roman Empire. They cannot find a single town in Scotland in which the name originates from the Latin language. And so if we separate England from Britain and realize that Britain is a bigger sphere than England, we notice that the very first mention of Scotland is by Agricola in an old Latin text, and it's just these 17 petty sub-principalities, and they built Hadrian's Wall, and the Romans never go there. So
hold that thought. Basically, of course, we speak not of Britain, we speak of Great Britain, which was not only England, it was certainly Wales and Scotland and Ireland as well, but entirely different cultures, and this is what people really have not thought about. We'll be back in just a moment.
While the storm clouds gather.
All right, Donald, you go right right ahead.
Okay. So what happens over a period of time is that what's present-day England, they're conquered by the Romans. And then once Rome starts to fall apart, their old mercenaries, the Saxons, they move into that power vacuum, and then the Saxons dominate England. And then eventually what happens is the Normans come in and they conquer England.
Now, who are the Saxons, and basically how do they differ from the English? Are they a branch of England, or are they coming over from the continent?
They're coming over from the continent. It's part of Germany, Saxony. And once the Romans leave, they think, hey, we now want to be the rulers. And so what you have develop in England that you don't have develop in the Celtic countries is a centralized power. Obviously, Rome was from the top down. Caesar was basically a god by the time you switch from the Roman Republic to the Roman Empire. And the Saxons adopt this mentality when they come in. They're the conquerors. It's their right to rule everything. They come in and they wipe out what is civilization there in England. The late author Russell Kirk says that basically there's nobody that's English that's educated except maybe a few people that were spared as slaves. They came in and they destroyed the churches, they destroyed the schools, they destroyed the villages, and they dominated. And
we speak of Anglo-Saxon. In other words, this is supposedly a combination then of English and Saxon. Is that what we're referring to?
Well, the Angles, I think, came over from a part of France, and Saxons came over from Germany, and now what we're supposed to believe, I mean, even if you look at World War II, you see this Anglo-American, because we're supposed to believe that all of Britain is Anglo, and that's the culture that we received, and therefore it's the same culture. And so what I'm writing about is challenging that and saying, no, it's not. There's a completely different culture that developed in the rest of Britain. And again, it's the late author Russell Kirk talked about there being a Celtic fringe. So when you look at Britain today and we think of it as England, it wasn't. Cornwall was a Celtic country. Devon was a Celtic country. Wales was. Scotland was. So as the Saxons and the Normans come in, the original British people, they pushed back and they withdrew from those people that wanted to dominate them. And there's a completely different culture in the majority of the British Isles that develops from the one that develops in London.
And that is why, of course, the people then, they were loyal to the king, they fought for the king, they believed in this top-down structure of government, certainly, but this is not what the Scots, what the Irish, what the Welsh wanted. They wanted a society where men would be free, and we'll be back in just a moment here. Well, this is Dr. Stan, and certainly Donald has some very interesting ideas. We hear the term Anglo-Saxon. Well, apparently the Anglos had come over from France to conquer England. Certainly the Saxons had come over from a section of Germany to conquer England. But in England, the idea was we will have a king. And, of course, the king would rule, and the people went right along with that. You had your nobility, you had a class structure. But that was not true in the Celtic countries, in Wales, certainly in Ireland, in Scotland. They wanted a society where people would be free. They were not Anglo-Saxon, they were Celtic. They had different ideas, they had a different culture, and they wanted a culture where men would be free, where you would not have a ruling hierarchy. Would that be a fair assessment?
That's a very fair assessment. So what you have in Scotland, you look at the clan system. It was all bottom up. People, when they voted for their clan chief, the clan chief could be your judge, he would be your military leader. Even the form of Christianity that sprouts up in the Celtic countries is different. It's what you have, the colonies, and it's based on the abbot system rather than a bishopric system where you believed that you went into your community and you captured your community for Christ. And these people actually sent missionaries to the continent to try and get people to understand that you needed to put your faith in God for saving your community rather than a bishopric system, which they believed was political and served man. So everything in the Celtic countries, from religion to military leadership to government, was all a local choice.
And I think that's so interesting, because basically the whole idea, certainly in Europe and certainly in England, was, of course, that you had your religion, and the king used the religion, the religion used the king, certainly the religion of the Protestant Church used the king to center their power and control, and the king used the church. And so the church and state worked together to subject the people to their tyranny. And this is the way it was in Europe, this is the way that it was in England, but this was not the view of the people in Scotland, who wanted to be free and wanted a bottom-up system rather than a top-down system. This is really what you're saying, isn't it?
That's exactly what happens. I mean, if you fast forward several centuries, what happens is the Presbyterians idolize the colonies, and it gets to the point to where when the Reformation comes, John Knox comes, those guys come, there's a guy named Andrew Melville, and King James calls the Presbyterians before him because he's going to put down Presbyterianism because he wants his own church. He wants to be like every other monarch in Europe, and he's going to have his religion as dictated by the king. And could you imagine anybody doing this, the president or any leader today? He walks up to King James, he grabs him by the sleeve, and he starts shaking him, and he says, "You're God's silly vassal." And then goes on to explain to him that there's two kingdoms, an earthly kingdom and a heavenly kingdom. And in the heavenly kingdom, King James is nothing more than a citizen. He is no ruler, because the only ruler in the heavenly kingdom is God. And that's where you start to get this separation between the state church and what eventually comes to the United States as a belief that there should not be a state church. With the Calvinist movement, and especially in Scotland, they become vehemently opposed to any form of a state church.
Okay, go right ahead. Well, I think that's fascinating. I've always seen glimpses of this, but I haven't heard it expressed quite as well as you express it. So, and basically, of course, the Calvinists, for those of you who don't know, I mean, certainly Calvin, these people came out of Switzerland, but they had very, very strong beliefs, and certainly about the separation of church and state, and they were entirely different than the other churches which went right along with government controls. So pick the story up.
All right. So through the centuries, what you have is you have a continual battle between the Stuart Jameses that are 1 through 7 in Scotland, and they come in and they want to centralize everything from government to religion. And so if you start with the first James Stuart, he comes in, I want to say 1424, 1425, and the first thing that he does to establish his power, because he wants a divine right monarchy like all the rest of the monarchs in Europe, he murders a couple of the most powerful dukes, and one of the dukes, he kills both of his heirs to kind of say, this is where I am. And a year later, he says, this is how the church is going to be. And he starts implementing how he, as a Scottish king, is going to have a state church in Scotland. And that doesn't take. So about 3 years later, he summons all the clan chiefs, because you figure if the clan is locally controlled and it's bottom up instead of top down, that's something that he is not comfortable with, because he wants his divine right monarchy. So in 1428, he calls 50 clan chiefs to him under the auspices of negotiation, and he murders them all. And only one of the clan chiefs, the Lord of the Isles, escapes, and he eventually tracks him down and murders them too. So from the very beginning of the Stuart family, when they take over from the Bruce family, there's this, we want everything centralized, and we're going to do it the way the continental Europeans do it, and they look to London with a bunch of envy, because in London you have this divine right monarchy, and this monarch that controls everything in your life, including your religion. And so what happens is, when the Presbyterians pick up where the Coldies left off, you have a whole philosophy that says, you cannot control us in any way. So in addition to religion, what you had with Robert the Bruce, and this is very important as we move forward, because this is the crux of the whole battle, whether you're talking religion or government. When Robert the Bruce was elected, and most people don't understand that in Scotland before the Stuarts, the king was elected. And the way that he was elected is in 1320, the Scots got together and sent a letter to the Pope. And they said, you claim to have authority over us, you claim to have jurisdiction over us, but you have put a tyrant and a murderer over us. And therefore, since we are equal because we are created by God, and so therefore we have equal rights to you, we're throwing off your yoke, and we're rejecting your English king, and we're electing Robert the Bruce as our king. And oh, by the way, if he doesn't protect our God-given rights, then we will overthrow him also, and we'll elect a new king. And so what you have in Scotland is this idea that government is by compact, which, if you're religious at all, you understand from the Old and New Testaments the idea of covenant. Well, compact is the Scottish idea that because we're created equally before God, that we can enter into a compact with each other under the authority of God's natural law, and that's what the basis of our system of government will be. And that's obviously very different from the continental Roman, English, Norman, Saxon idea that God picks one guy and then he rules everything in your life. And so this idea rolls forward, and you will see several of these declarations. So you have the Declaration of Arbroath in 1320 that sets the pattern. So there's 4 parts to a Scottish declaration under the Right of Compact. And that is the first thing that you do, is you send a notice to the person who has aggrieved you, and you list your grievances. And then the second part of that is you present yourself against tyranny, and you eliminate the option of backing down off of your natural rights or retreating to what they would refer to as the state of previous injury. And then after that, you declare your independence under the authority of the natural law that God gave you. And then the fourth part of it is that you give a high-minded statement of principled determination that I'm not backing down, I will fight you to no end. And we've largely ignored that because the English Whig historians are the ones that have written the books. But you see that happen in the first National Covenant. So if you go to school and you read the book, you hear National Covenant, England, 1630s and 40s, English Civil War. Well, that was Scotland's second covenant, because Scotland had a covenant in 1581. And they issue that compact then. And then they helped the English issue one for Britain that leads to the 1640s Civil War. And then you'll see it again in 1670 or in 1680 with the Sanquhar Declaration. They say we're throwing Charles II out, and they go through the same 4 things that they did in the Declaration of Arbroath. And you see that come all the way down to Thomas Jefferson in the Declaration of Independence. I mean, one of the first things he says is that when we want to dissolve the bonds which have connected us with another, and he basically says it's incumbent upon us to list our grievances. I mean, if you look at the Declaration of Independence, a lot of it is a list of grievances against the king. That follows the same pattern all the way from the Declaration of Arbroath through the 2 covenants, through the Sanquhar Declaration, all the way down to 1776.
And so basically then what you're saying is the ideas that led to America were not English at all. It was basically trying to reestablish these concepts of government, of limited government, that were the very essence of Scots life, built upon the Scots clans, built upon a bottom-up form of government where everybody was answerable to God and not to government. Would that be a fair assessment?
That's exactly it. When I first approach people and they're used to going to school and they hear that this goes back to Magna Carta, and they start to question. I said, well, think about it this way. Is it or is it not absurd to think that a top-down divine right monarchy that was the precursor to modern dictatorship gave us a bottom-up, leveling, locally controlled society that put the supreme power in the hands of the people rather than an almighty ruler.
And of course, people really have forgotten it. Magna Carta was signed about in the early 1200s, when a group of noblemen took the king out and just told him, you're either going to sign this charter and give us rights, or we're going to kill you. That's just that simple. And as a result, why the king signed that. And that was really the first really document that limited the power of kings. And they went, of course, from the Magna Carta to the Bill of Rights and the Charter of Rights. And there were a number, certainly, of British documents, but they were all aimed at this idea of limiting the power of government so men could be free. At one time we believed that here, but of course the wicked people, what I call the Brotherhood, has taken over our schools. They've taken God and prayer out of our schools, and without, of course, any hope for freedom in America.
While the storm clouds gather.
Well, this is Dr. Stan, and certainly it's a lot easier to have a Bible in prison than it is in the school today. In fact, if we had a lot more Bibles in schools, we wouldn't have so many people in prisons, and people don't understand that what's happened in America is not happening by accident. It was John Adams who said our form of government was made for a moral and religious people. It would not work for any other. And that's really what it's all about. That's why they had to destroy the religious foundation of America, and why America is a post-Christian nation today. Our guest is Donald Wilson. Pick up the story.
Okay, well, you were talking about Magna Carta, and obviously what I'm saying is in contradiction of the Magna Carta being the basis for our rights. If people put it in context, and I find a lot of people don't put things in context, Magna Carta is 1215. England has gone off, fought in the Crusades, the treasury is empty, the king needs money. And so he goes to the nobles and he says, I want you to retire my war debt. And they know they have him over a barrel. So they say, we'll help you with your debt if you give us these rights. Now, there's nothing at all in the American tradition that says rights are either bequeathed or taken away by the monarch. Everything in the American tradition says that these are rights naturally given by God. And there's a movie that came out a couple of years ago that I think would be great for people to see to really illustrate what I'm talking about. And it's called Ironclad, and it had Paul Giamatti, who played John Adams, and he plays King John in this movie. Well, it's about the year after Magna Carta was signed, and it's about what happens to those nobles and the war that he carries out against them for violating English tradition. So, there's a shortcut to kind of get to some of what I'm talking about. There's nothing in the English tradition about these God-given rights until 1689. And most people, they don't realize that what happens in Scotland is many of Scotland's King Jameses, they die at a very young age. And so they have regents take over. And so there's one regent in 1543 that takes power, and his name is Cardinal Beaton. And he is a zealot, and he starts murdering Reformed believers left and right. So a lot of Protestants, they go south to what is today Cambridge, and they end up setting up shop there. And when they set up shop there, they have a big effect. And people in Cambridge come to start believe in the Reformed theology, and they start to reject the state church. And one of the things that's interesting that happens in Cambridge, there's a Welsh family there by the name of Williams, and they come in, and they buy into this Reformed theology that the Presbyterians are teaching down in England. And they want to serve in government, but Williams is a lowly Welsh name in the eyes of the English. And so what they do is they change their name to a more prestigious English name, because one of the women in their family had married into an English family, and that name was Cromwell. So you have Oliver Williams, whose name becomes Oliver Cromwell. And so what happens by the time you get to the 1640s is you have the quote-unquote, what we teach is the English Civil War. Well, it's between a Welshman named Oliver Williams and a Scotsman named Charles Stuart. There's really not a lot English about it, other than maybe some of the battles took place in England. And I think this shows how history has not been closely looked at, or how historians in the past have written it to kind of match what it is that they want to believe in. And so...
Hold that thought.
Okay.
Well, this is Dr. Stan, and certainly Donald is saying that really, of course, our traditions really don't go back to the Magna Carta, because, of course, it was the Magna Carta where the king was beginning to give some rights to the people. Of course, he took them back just as soon as he could. But, of course, our concepts of liberty came out of Scotland and out of Wales, where these ideas, these Celtic ideas came, that idea that rights came from God, that men were inherently right, had a right to freedom, and that, of course, freedom of the government should come from below, and people would give the government certain functions, but limited functions, so that men could be free, because they recognized when you gave power to the government, why it would be misused. And basically, this is the story of all monarchies. This is the story of what's going on in England today, and all the people rallying behind the Queen and rallying behind the King. Doesn't matter how nice he is and how nice his wife is. Basically, you have a top-down form of government there that is controlled by a ruling elite, certainly, where the king is the figurehead, but behind them are very powerful forces that control the structure of English society, where the individual has few, if any, rights, and you get out of line, you end up like you do here in the United States. And believe me, if you don't think that they kill people here in the United States, get out of line. You need to hear our 4-CD set on paid assassins. On Deadly Assassins is the title of it. We're actually interview government assassins. This is not accidental. This is not theoretical. This is not make-believe. I interviewed these 2 CIA assassins and then a third man who actually tracked down the assassin who was paid to kill General George Patton. Why? Because they couldn't let Patton come home and tell the American people following World War II that he was all set to send his troops, his tanks, his brigades, his divisions across Europe to take Berlin. No, they didn't want that. They cut off his gasoline. The last thing they wanted, of course, was an early end to the war, and, of course, they had to silence Patton, which they did with an assassin. Well, go right ahead, Donald.
Oh, okay. And so what happens once the Presbyterians take hold in Cambridge, really, even though they're Presbyterians in Scotland, they can't be Presbyterians in England because the king is so much stronger in England. So what you have developed, in England you have Congregationalism, and in Scotland you have Presbyterianism. And most people don't realize those are not theological points, those are forms of church government. So where the king is less powerful in Scotland, you can have these presbyteries exist because the nobles back the citizens against a centralized power. Well, in England, where the king can rule with an iron fist, you can't have an organization like a presbytery, and so each congregation rules itself, hence the name Congregationalism. And what you have develop in England is that and this is another term we have to get down the way we need to separate English from British. We need to separate Puritan from separatist. So if you look at it from the American point of view, anybody who wasn't part of the state church was a Puritan. But if you look at it from the British point of view, there were Puritans who were tolerated, but then there were those people that were the separatists. And the separatists were basically the Calvinists in any country. So in England, that means the Congregationalists. In Scotland, that means the Presbyterians. And the government cracks down on these Congregationalist separatists as the king sees them. And that's what starts driving them to come to the United States and come to Plymouth. So when you get to the Mayflower Compact, most people think it's an old word for contract, but no, we're right back to the compact idea of what elected Robert the Bruce in 1320. And this is a key that we need to recover in our constitutional study, is there is a huge difference between the word compact and the word contract. So when those Congregationalists, who were really nothing more than English Calvinists, get to what will become the United States, they use compact on purpose. They're using the Scottish tradition, not the English tradition. And so eventually what happens is Bloody Mary Tudor comes to the throne, and she starts, in the words of one historian, quote, devoutly burning Protestants, close quote. Well, by now, Cardinal Beaton is thrown out of power. He was killed by the people in Scotland. So they leave Cambridge and they go back to Scotland. But they've left this Congregationalism in England. And so in Scotland, what you have is Presbyterianism come back with a vengeance. now that Cardinal Beaton is gone. And that's when you start getting the Covenants, and eventually you'll get John Locke. And then eventually these people move to Northern Ireland, and they start getting persecuted there.
Oh, for our listeners out there, of course, John Locke was one of the philosophers, 100 years before America was created. But John Locke was one of the philosophers from who these ideas came that certainly were so instrumental in forming the beliefs certainly of Adams, and certainly of John Adams and Samuel Adams, and certainly of Thomas Jefferson. And so we'll be back in just a moment. If you have any questions at all, our telephone number is 1-888-24-LIBERTY. 1-888-24-LIBERTY or 464-8295. You have to know what you believed to know where we are today.
While the storm clouds gather across the sea, let us swear allegiance to a land that's free. Let us all be grateful for a land so fair, as we raise our voices in a solemn prayer.
All right, Donald, you go right ahead.
Okay, so what happens after the Presbyterians go back to Scotland is that eventually the English beat the O'Neills in Ulster, but they don't want to settle there themselves, and so they promise religious toleration to the Presbyterians if they'll move to Northern Ireland. So that's exactly what they do. And when they get there, the way they entice them there is they say, we'll give you really, really low rent for 100 years. And so the Presbyterians move there, and so we can move on to get into where the United States is. They stay there for 100 years, and by the end of this 100 years, they've got the best wool trade in the world, and the English are very upset with it. And so they put a blockade on English wool. The 100-year leases are now up, and so they triple their rent. So you now have no source of income, and at the same time your rent has tripled. So people are starving. They're not doing well. Scotland has been blockaded by the English to prevent trade with the Netherlands and other countries that they're more in line with. And what comes up is a fight to unify England, Scotland, and Wales into a new free trade zone called Great Britain. And out of that comes Scotland's greatest patriot, a guy named Andrew Fletcher. And most Americans have probably never heard of Andrew Fletcher, but they'll recognize all of his ideas. So it's 1698, and they can see what's coming because Queen Anne has no heir, and Scotland does not want to become a colony of France, and it does not want to become a colony of England. And so Andrew Fletcher steps forward and says, here are our ideas for maintaining our sovereignty and our independence. So between 1698 and 1705, he's arguing for these and trying to do everything he can. And the things that he comes up with is sovereignty through the compact. That when Queen Anne dies, we'll elect a monarch by compact. We want to keep our own sovereignty. But we realize we're a small country, so we want to have some common defensive spheres. So how about England has a militia, Ireland has a militia, Scotland has a militia, Wales has a militia, and we'll join together in common defense. And then the last thing that he says, in order for this to work, for us to throw off any tyrant, whether foreign or domestic, is that we have to have the right to keep and to bear arms. That our militia must be well regulated, and we must have the ability to keep and bear arms.
Hold that thought. Hold the thought.
Okay.
Well, this is Dr. Stan, and certainly Donald is talking about a Scots patriot named Andrew Fletcher, who most people have never thought of, but basically, certainly at the end of the 1600s, he was writing a lot about certainly these ideas of freedom, and basically, of course, the people needed to have militias to maintain the integrity of their nations. People had to have a right to have weapons, and there should be weapons for the Welsh and for the Irish and for the Scots and for the English. Everybody should have that, and if they're country was threatened, they would be in a position to defend it. But, of course, the most important thing as far as maintaining freedom was this idea to keep and bear arms. People had to have the right to guns if they wanted to be free. Now, basically, you go back and you read the history of the beginning of America. You read certainly when Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence, and when he talks about we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, all of these ideas, so many of the ideas put forward in Jefferson's writings came from John Locke 50 to 75 years earlier. But certainly in those days, people used to study ideas. We don't study them today. They dumb down our people. They get us involved watching football and watching all these television programs and The Voice and all of these things. But basically, we should be studying these ideas of freedom, because if people don't understand freedom, they don't understand where ideas come from. And of course, the idea, my goodness, look at all this crime. What we've got to do is take the guns away from the people. And yet, if you look in America, in the communities where they have the right to keep and bear arms, you have very little crime. And then you go into Washington, D.C., and you go into cities, Chicago and New York, where they have strict gun laws. Why, of course, you have tremendous levels of crime. So basically, it's inversely proportional. They know what they're doing. They're not interested in preventing crime or murders or suddenly shooting. They want to disarm the people because they want, of course, to establish a dictatorship and what was once the land of the free and the home of the brave, because they understand certainly these ideas. It's just that they never teach them in our schools or universities today. And I think Donald's information is fascinating. And before we go on, Donald, I want you to tell our listeners where they can get your material, how they can get the ideas that you put forward, and then we'll go ahead. And incidentally, if you're out there in the listening audience, our telephone number is 1-888-24-LIBERTY, 1-888-24-LIBERTY, or 464-8295. Donald, how can people get your material?
Well, if they want to get it today, createspace.com has a site. Actually, I put up a quick Facebook page. So if anybody who has Facebook goes to St. Andrew's American Revolution, and it's spelled ST period, I didn't spell the word out, they can find it there and then just go to About, and I'll have the link to CreateSpace. Or if they want to go directly to createspace.com, it's createspace.com/4404663. And I believe by the end of the week it'll be up on Amazon. And I think within the next 2 weeks you should be able to get it out of any outlet, like even if you walked into Barnes & Noble and ordered it from one of those people there. So it's I'd like to say I was smart enough to plan it for Constitution Day, but I've just been working on it over the summer, and it just happens to be available for Constitution Day. So
will it be available in book form?
Yes, it'll be on CreateSpace. It's ordered. It's a trade paper. It's $15.99. So I'd encourage as many people as want to go there, and they'll get a lot more detail. Obviously, we're trying to fit centuries of information into a small time period, so I think if they enjoy the show, then they'll enjoy the book even more. All
right, fine. Go right ahead. What is the title of the book?
It's St. Andrew's American Revolution.
St. Andrew's American Revolution. St. Andrew's American Revolution. Go right ahead.
Okay. And you had brought up John Locke, and so I think that's one of the interesting things also is the people that portray the English version of our history, they don't realize where John Locke is coming from. So when you look at early America and all the colonial colleges, they taught Algernon Sidney and John Locke. But when I read John Locke in college, it always troubled me on the very first page. It said, well, this is an answer to the infamous Robert Filmer. And I'm like, well, that's great that in 1690 he was infamous, but I don't know who he is today. Well, since I've gone back and done my research, what happened as part of the idea of compact under Presbyterianism, there's a gentleman named George Buchanan. And in 1580, he wrote a book called De Jure Regni Apud Scotos, which roughly translated is the laws of the kingdom of the Scots. And he basically said that you have a right to overthrow the tyrant when he violates your natural rights. And so Robert Filmer in 1624 opposes this idea, but his book doesn't get published until after he's dead. So that comes out in 1680. So John Locke and Algernon Sidney are responding to Robert Filmer's criticism of George Buchanan and the Presbyterian idea of compact. So even if you talk about John Locke, he's still defending the original Scottish writer, and his whole story is interesting as to the way that he came about to Whiggism, because a real interesting guy to look at as far as Whiggism goes, which is this Presbyterian compact idea, is the first Earl of Shaftesbury is a guy named Anthony Cooper. And he falls in love with this idea. So he helps overthrow Charles and bring in Oliver Cromwell. Well, the tutor to the Earl of Shaftesbury's children is John Locke. That's how John Locke finds out about this idea. But you see the Earl of Shaftesbury go back and forth because he helps make Cromwell dictator, and then after he helps make Cromwell dictator, he sees the error of his ways, and he comes back and says, we got to get rid of this guy. So even down to the philosophers, that the people who push this modern idea that our rights come from England, they don't. If you look at Locke or you look at Cambridge or any of those are a direct result of what comes out of Scotland. Now, the interesting thing about Buchanan saying you have the right to kill the prince when he violates the natural rights that God gave you is that this idea of the prince goes down throughout history, and that's one of the things that I found real interesting when I got to the Declaration of Independence in this country, and I asked my friends as kind of a joke, was Jefferson, did he go out on a drinking binge the night before he wrote the Declaration? Didn't he know the Declaration was written to King George? Well, of course he knew it was written to King George. Then tell me, why does Jefferson say in the Declaration, a prince whose character is thus marked by every act which may define a tyrant is unfit to be the ruler of free people? Well, because this idea, by the time it's come to the United States and the Presbyterians have had their colleges throughout the country, all these people that are the descendants of the Celtic community know what Jefferson is referencing. Jefferson and the idea of the prince is the same thing that John Witherspoon taught when he was at Princeton, is the same thing that's gone all the way back to George Buchanan in 1580. The people in the colonies know this. We're supposed to think that they were a bunch of backwoods people that didn't know things, but they were probably the most educated people in the world, top to bottom. That was something that happened in Scotland with the Presbyterian school system, and it's something that happened here. Because if we remember that Scotland was the poorest country in the world, but they wanted to be able to read their own Bibles, they're the ones that set up the school systems. And they duplicated that when they came here, which for some people would be kind of amazing to look at the school systems and the way they've been set up on the Presbyterian model and think what they teach today.
And, of course, people really don't understand the history. Remember, Harvard was created somewhere in the 1640s. Harvard University was established as a Christian school where people were going to learn about God, and, of course, they were going to learn about government as well. But it was a Christian school, and then it was taken over by the wicked people, and so they established Yale, and that was taken over by the wicked people, and they established Princeton, and same thing every step of the way. But all of these are really started as church universities, which were actually pushing these ideas of individual liberty. And then, of course, certainly they were taken over by people who wanted to centralize power in the hands of a ruling elite. And step by step, this is where we've come until we are where we are today. Well, do you feel that John Locke was a good philosopher or a bad philosopher, and that his ideas were worthy or not worthy?
I think they were worthy, but one of the things that stunned me is reading Algernon Sidney's Discourses on Government. And if you're an American who really wants to understand what the founders believed, John Locke is great in the fact that he's concise, easy to read, the teacher can assign him, you can easily get through it in a semester. But when I was in class, somebody said, well, what morality is John Locke talking about? And sometimes I'm not always politically correct, so I looked at the person, are you kidding me? It's 1690 and it's England. Are you being facetious? You know he's talking about Christian morality. But where Locke is very concise, Algernon Sidney is not. Algernon Sidney is over 600 pages, and he lays out every example that he can from throughout history that's known at the time to illustrate very clearly why they believe these things. And not that I'm out here to push a bunch of product for other people, but Algernon Sidney's hard to get a hold of, and there's a great place that's republishing the classics of liberty. It's called Liberty Fund, and they're out of Indiana. Just do an internet search on them. They've republished Algernon Sidney, so we can still access that. Algernon Sidney was taught by all the Scotch-Irish in the school. So when you look at Hampden Sidney College, it's Algernon Sidney that they're talking about. And that's what the founding generation probably read Sidney more than Locke, although knowing them and as educated as they were, they probably read both. But Sidney's what they used in the classroom, unlike today when we use Locke in the classroom. So he's a great guy, but he doesn't lay it out as clearly and concisely as Algernon Sidney does. And there's actually a third guy whose book I can't get a hold of. His last name is Campbell. So there were three people that were actually answering Robert Filmer in the late 1600s.
And because most people really don't understand America because they don't understand our history, they don't understand the philosophy. They do not understand this constant battle between those who want the all-powerful state that will provide for us from the cradle to the grave. What's wrong with helping people who have illness, Sidney? Well, I'll tell you what's wrong with helping them, and that is it's not the function of the federal government, because a government that can provide care for the elderly can also deprive the elderly of care. And basically, those who certainly want a government that can provide pensions for the people have to understand they must eventually be able, when they run out of money, to be able, of course, to strip the elderly and everybody else of their funds. America was different, and America was great, because, of course, our people were good, and the power of the government was to be limited, and matters dealing with life, liberty, and property, and helping those in need was to be taken care of at the state and predominantly at the local level. And when I went into medical practice in 1960, well, I went into medicine. I got my medical degree in 1952. Every state in the United States had a county hospital, and nobody went without medical care. If you could pay, fine. If you couldn't pay, why, they'd have a home, they'd put a lien on your home, and basically if you didn't have a home, you got your medical care anyway, and the good doctors from the community came out because that was part of the tradition of medicine, to take care of people. You did not go into medicine to make money. You went into medicine because you wanted to care for people. And then, of course, only later on did I found out that when you got to be a doctor, you could make a good deal of money. But that was never the motivation for the people who were in medical school with me. And I would simply comment, I learned about Jewish people when I was in medical school because a third of my class were Jewish. And basically they were certainly there in medical school because they were smart. And I will tell you that I learned the greatest respect for them because they were certainly they made up at least fully a third of our medical school class, and they were there. Some of them, a few of them, are still living and still practicing medicine. Wonderful, wonderful people with a goal to take care of their fellow man. So basically there's so much we don't get, but the important things you need to learn from Donald certainly is this whole concept of government that comes from the bottom up rather than from the top down. And when I see all those people over in England cheering the king and queen and almost worship them, it's just like we see in America today. All the people who think Obama is great. Why? Because the media tells them he's great, and yet here's a man who is using somebody else's draft card, somebody else's Social Security number, who does not have a full-length birth certificate, who put forward a totally fraudulent one. And yet he's the President of the United States, and he's had the ability to take us from conflict to conflict, and believe me, he has still not given up the idea of involving us in conflict in the Middle East, which will kill millions of Americans, but he doesn't care how many Americans die because he marches to a different drummer, because I believe he worships a different God. Our guest is Donald Wilson. Our telephone number, 1-888-24-LIBERTY, 1-888-24-LIBERTY, or 464-8295. One more time, your website, please, Donald.
You either go to Facebook for St. Andrew's American Revolution, or if you go to CreateSpace, it's createspace.com, and then it's /4404663.
All right, fine. If anybody out there in the audience has a question for our guest, why, this is the time. He won't be with us that much longer, but it's fascinating information. And these are the things we need to go over again and again. We need to understand the foundation of our faith. We need to understand the foundation of this once great Christian nation, no longer a Christian nation, post-Christian nation today, because the wicked people have organized to take control of our educational system, and they even have their agents planted within our churches. Donald, what can people do with the information you have, and what should people be doing today?
Well, one of my favorite quotes of all time is Edmund Burke, who, by the way, is not English, he's Irish, but that the only thing necessary for good men, or for evil to triumph, is for good men to do nothing. And I think a lot of what's happened is people start feeling defeated. They feel like, what is it that I can do? There's a bumper sticker that the left uses that actually you don't have to be a leftist to believe it, and that's speak your voice, even if your voice shakes.
Okay, let's go to Ron, who's calling from Washington, because we're getting late. Hi, Ron. How are we doing? A question or comment for our guest?
Yes, I find this information fascinating. I just wanted to ask your guest about the American Civil War. It seemed to me like the South had adopted the philosophy of the Scottish, and the North, the philosophy of the English, as far as strong central government.
What was your thoughts on that, Donald?
Well, I'm not as strong on the Civil War as I should be, but basically you're onto the right thing there. One of the things that I think is a telling statistic that we don't know is that in 1790, during the first census, when they took that census, Celts outnumbered Anglos by a ratio of 2 to 1. We really have no idea how many Celts came here and what influenced us. And the reason why there were so many Celts in the South is up to about 1725, they went through Boston, but they had a state church in Massachusetts that the Presbyterians didn't want to belong to. So starting about 1725, 1730, they all started in Philadelphia. They started heading out towards Pittsburgh. They started having problems with the Quakers because the Quakers hated them, and so they sold their land to the incoming Palatinate Germans, and they went down the wagon trail, and they overwhelmed everything from Virginia, North Carolina, inland South Carolina. They got to be so numerous that in 1782, Georgia outlawed Scottish settlers. That's
and I think it's
important
for people to understand the Civil War was never fought about slavery at all. That is what they tell you, but so much what they tell you isn't true.
While storm clouds gather.
Okay, Donald. Ron, did you have anything else you wanted to say before we let you go?
Yeah, well, I think a real telling statistic, since we don't have time to go through everything, that when you look at the Constitutional Convention, every single plan, major plan, with the exception of the 3/5 clause, was offered by these Orangemen, these Whigs, these graduates of Princeton. So James Madison wrote the Virginia plan. Edmund Randolph submitted it. William Patterson wrote the New Jersey plan. Oliver Ellsworth wrote the Connecticut Compromise. And I feel that I need to say something on the 3/5 clause, because I was on the internet today and I see people spreading this lie that James Madison is the one who wrote the 3/5 clause. James Wilson is the one that wrote the 3/5 clause and suggested it. You can go check the Constitutional Convention notes. But everything major in our Constitution, from the 10 amendments that were the Bill of Rights, to the Virginia Plan, to the New Jersey Plan, to the Connecticut Compromise, were all written by these Orangemen / Presbyterian Whig / graduates of Princeton. 11 of the men at the Constitutional Convention studied at Princeton and studied under John Witherspoon. So
okay.
I'd leave people with that.
Ron, anything else you would like to say before we let you go?
Well, it often seemed to me like the Civil War was a continuation of the war between England and Scotland.
Well, in some ways you may very well be right. Interesting thought. Appreciate your calling, and God bless, and keep up the great work up there in Washington. If we can help you in any way, are you still running for office there?
Yes, still running for school board.
All right, fine. Well, you be sure to let us know. We'll get you on for a few programs before when's the election?
It's coming at this November.
Okay, fine. Well, we will, when we don't have time right now, but we'll go ahead and get you get to see some programs and get all the coverage we can for you. Okay?
Yes, sir.
God bless. Thanks for everything you do. And Donald, I think it's fascinating. I really enjoyed our program, and I would like to get you on to our other programs. We do a morning and evening program, afternoon program, and I think your information is vitally important. People have to understand where we came from, to understand where we are today, to understand tragically where we're going tomorrow.
Right. Well, I would love to.
God bless, and thanks very much.
God bless you.
Okay, fine. And of course, that was Donald Wilson. Hope you enjoyed the program. We'll be back here in just a moment. This is Dr. Stan, and we do hope you enjoyed the program we just had. Basically, we haven't talked about the origins of America for many, many years, and certainly sometimes we begin to forget about this. There's just so many things going on all the time. I think we need to go back from time to time and review our history, and review the concepts that John Locke put forward, and review the concepts that Montesquieu put forward. He wrote extensively about the difference between a republic and a democracy, and there were two or three other people who were really fundamental in putting forward the ideas that were picked up certainly during the following decades by Madison, and certainly by Adams, and certainly by Thomas Jefferson, that laid the foundation for America. I honestly believe that God had a hand in that. Basically, if you stop and think, Declaration of Independence, written on July 4th, 1776, had exactly 50 days to the day. I mean, July 4th, suddenly, 1826, Thomas Jefferson died. What are the chances, exactly 50 days to the day, that would happen? I mean, what are we talking about, 1 in a million? Basically, but God determines when we're born and when we die. And then, of course, the same day, another great patriot, his name was John Adams, who had actually been a protagonist of Jefferson's, and yet, of course, in the final years of their lives, they came to be good friends. And John Adams died exactly the same day. What is the chance, certainly 1 in 100 million, something like that they would both die that same day, exactly 50 years after the signing of the Declaration of Independence, which was the greatest freedom document of all time? But you see, we never talk about these things, or the part that God has played in where we are today. But of course, we once were a great Christian nation. We're no longer a Christian nation. We're a post-Christian nation, and I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just, and His justice will not sleep forever. I think we're moving into some terrible times, and we'll talk more about that later. We do hope, of course, you'll want to get my book, Brotherhood of Darkness. We hope you'll certainly want to get the material that we have. Go to our website. We have all sorts of books and tape sets on the origins of our country. You need to get our 4-CD set on our secret government. You need to get 4-CD set on our secret societies. You need to get certainly our material, our 4-CD set on the threat of an EMP attack. The DVD on that, certainly you need to understand the foundations of the freedom that has been lost. And so if you'd like, of course, to help Radio Liberty so we can maintain our network of stations out across America, our telephone number is 1-800-544-8927, 1-800-544-8927. Our webpage is radioliberty.com, and you can certainly get our programs there. You can read our newsletters. You can certainly watch our DVDs. We have some wonderful DVDs up there. If you haven't seen my interview with Ambassador Earl T. Smith, the American ambassador to Cuba at the time, we installed Fidel Castro. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, we installed Fidel Castro. We knew he was a communist, but you needed an enemy, and just like we have to have an enemy over there in the Near East today, in the Middle East, and so we creating these enemies, and we finance the enemies like Al-Qaeda. We finance Al-Qaeda, it's certainly in Syria, and we fight Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, and nobody nobody ever says, gee, that doesn't make any sense. No, we're too busy watching football and other things. Well, ladies and gentlemen, basically, if you're not watching what's happening to government, then the evil people will take charge and will destroy this nation, and that's exactly what they're doing. You need to get my material. Go to our website, radioliberty.com. If you'd like one of our catalogs, we'll be glad to send you one free of charge. If you're in a financial position to help us, we'd love to hear from you. And our telephone number again, 1-800-544-8927. 1-800-544-8927. Our webpage is radioliberty.com. We ask you to pray for America. We ask you to pray for revival for our leaders, our ministers, but please pray for my ministry, Radio Liberty, for our provision and protection. We got a great program the next hour. Don't even think of changing the dial.